How many civilizations has Earth forgotten? Or perhaps how many were never meant to be remembered at all? History often feels complete when viewed from a distance, like a smooth surface uninterrupted by doubt. Yet the closer one listens, the more the silence begins to speak. Between the oldest written records and the deep rhythms of geological time, there are spans that feel uncomfortably empty, not merely undocumented, but erased, as if something once stood there, lived there, understood the world in ways no longer legible to us. Before you allow your body to sink fully into this comfort, before the edges of the day soften and dissolve, take just a very small moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if something in what I'm whispering makes you want to remain a little longer. If you wish, share where and when you're listening. I'm always curious about the small points of light drifting together through this night. What follows is not an answer, but a listening. A willingness to notice the gaps, the fractures, the places where memory thins. Because sometimes what a civilization leaves behind is not stone or text, but absence. And absence, too, can be a kind of evidence. Human history, as it is commonly told, rests on a narrow ledge of time, a few thousand years of writing, a sequence of kingdoms, empires, revolutions, and collapses. It is presented as a continuous ascent from ignorance to understanding, from stone to silicon. Yet beneath this tidy narrative lies a deeper unease. The Earth itself is old beyond comprehension. Ice cores speak of hundreds of thousands of years. Sediment layers whisper of cycles measured not in generations, but in ages. Against this vastness, the recorded story of humanity appears strangely thin, almost fragile, like a thread stretched across an abyss. This discomfort has long been present, even if rarely named. Early geologists struggled with it when they first realized that mountains were not sudden creations, but the result of incomprehensibly slow forces. Later, archaeologists encountered it when they uncovered cities already ancient to the people who had buried them. Each discovery pushed the origin point back a little further, but never far enough to quiet the feeling that something remained unresolved. There are moments when the past appears too orderly, too convenient. Civilizations seem to emerge abruptly, already equipped with agriculture, architecture, cosmology, and law. Writing appears fully formed without clear prototypes. Monumental construction begins almost immediately after supposed periods of cultural infancy. These are not impossibilities, but they are tensions, subtle ones, the kind that linger at the edge of thought when the noise of certainty fades. One of the oldest of these tensions lies in the idea of progress itself. Progress assumes continuity. It assumes that knowledge accumulates, that each generation builds upon the last. Yet the archaeological record often tells a different story. It shows interruptions, sudden declines, technologies lost and never recovered. Skills abandoned not because they failed, but because the societies that sustained them vanished. In some cases, later cultures reoccupied the same land without understanding what their predecessors had built. This raises a quiet, unsettling question. If advanced knowledge can be lost once, why not many times? If societies can collapse into near total silence, leaving only fragments and myths, how confident can we be that the earliest layers we know are truly the first? Myths themselves seem to sense this uncertainty. Across continents, stories appear of earlier ages. Golden times, forgotten peoples, floods that reset the world, fires that cleansed it, skies that fell, or gods who withdrew. These narratives are often dismissed as symbolic or psychological. Yet their persistence is difficult to ignore. They behave less like inventions and more like memories blurred by time, reshaped to survive transmission when precise facts could not. Even within formal history, there are gaps that feel less like accidents and more like wounds. Periods where writing disappears, trade networks collapse, urban life retreats. The so-called Dark Ages are not merely times without light, but times without record. And in those absences, later generations project assumptions, filling silence with simplicity. But silence does not always mean emptiness. Sometimes it means erasure. Geology offers another layer of discomfort. Earth is not a stable stage upon which history politely unfolds. It is restless. Sea levels rise and fall by hundreds of feet. Ice sheets advance and retreat. Entire coastlines vanish beneath the ocean. Most human settlement, even today, clusters near water. If this was also true tens of thousands of years ago, then vast chapters of human activity now lie submerged, inaccessible, and largely unexplored, not destroyed perhaps, just hidden. When viewed this way, forgetting becomes less mysterious. Civilizations need not be annihilated by extraordinary forces to vanish from memory. Time alone is enough. Erosion smooths stone. Sediment buries walls. Forests reclaim cities. Oceans swallow harbors. And without writing that survives, without continuous cultural inheritance, even complex societies can dissolve into anonymity. What remains is a faint outline, a negative space in the historical record. We sense its shape, not through what is present, but through what feels missing. Tools that appear too refined for their context, knowledge that seems premature, structures whose purpose is still debated centuries after their discovery. These are not proofs, but prompts, invitations to doubt the completeness of the story we have inherited. It is important to linger here in this uncertainty, without rushing toward conclusions. The temptation to replace one rigid narrative with another is strong. Yet the deeper insight may lie elsewhere. Perhaps history is not a straight line with a single beginning, but a layered landscape. Peaks of memory rising above long valleys of forgetting. Each civilization believing itself unprecedented, unaware of how many times similar confidence has already faded into dust. If this is true, then the question is no longer simply how many civilizations Earth has forgotten. It becomes something more intimate, more unsettling. What conditions allow a civilization to be remembered at all? And what does it mean for us living now surrounded by records and data to assume that memory is guaranteed? Because forgetting is not always dramatic. Sometimes it arrives quietly, patiently, carried by time itself, and once it begins, it does not announce what it is taking with it. The uncertainty left behind does not fade after the first question is asked. It lingers, settling into the spaces between what is known and what feels deliberately absent. If civilizations have indeed risen and fallen before the earliest pages of recorded history, then forgetting is not an anomaly. It is a pattern, and patterns once noticed are difficult to unsee. There is a peculiar imbalance in how time is remembered. Geological time stretches endlessly, documented in stone and ice, while human time collapses inward, compressed into fragile lines of ink and clay. The Earth remembers almost everything. Humanity remembers almost nothing. This imbalance alone should invite caution. A species that has existed for hundreds of thousands of years, yet possesses only a few thousand years of written memory, may not be suffering from ignorance, but from amnesia. Archaeology occasionally brushes against this realization without fully numbing it. Layers are peeled back, one above another, each representing not only an era but a loss. Tools change, styles shift, entire ways of living appear and disappear. Sometimes the transitions are gradual. At other times they are abrupt, almost violent, as if a thread has been cut rather than slowly frayed. What is striking is not merely that cultures collapse, but that their collapses often leave surprisingly little behind. Consider how easily complexity can vanish. A city depends on trade, climate stability, and social trust. Remove one and the system strains. Remove several at once and it breaks. When this happens, the survivors do not preserve archives or monuments. They preserve themselves. Knowledge narrows. Skills become practical rather than symbolic. Writing, if it exists, becomes a luxury few can afford. Within a handful of generations, memory contracts to the immediate and the oral. An oral memory, while resilient in myth, is fragile in detail. This fragility is visible in the archaeological record itself. There are sites where advanced stonework sits beneath simpler constructions, as if later peoples inherited ruins without inheriting understanding. They repurposed stones, lived among remnants, and told stories about builders they could no longer name. In such moments, civilization does not reset cleanly. It stumbles forward, carrying fragments without context. The question then becomes not whether forgetting happens, but how often it has happened beyond our field of view. Mainstream timelines often imply a singular ascent. Hunter-gatherers to farmers, farmers to cities, cities to states. Yet reality resists such neat progression. There are pauses, reversals, periods where complexity retreats rather than advances. These are often labeled transitional or dark. But the label itself obscures more than it reveals. Darkness, after all, does not mean absence. It means lack of illumination. In this darkness, myths continue to glow faintly. Stories of previous worlds, of ages before the present one, recur with unsettling consistency across cultures that had no contact with one another. Some speak of cycles governed by fire or water. Others describe divine withdrawals, celestial disruptions, or moral collapses that precede destruction. While their imagery differs, their structure is similar. Something existed. Something was lost. What followed was lesser, diminished, incomplete. Modern scholarship tends to separate myth from history, as if they belong to entirely different domains. Yet this division may be more recent than we assume. For much of human existence, myth was not entertainment or allegory. It was memory structured for survival. It encoded warnings, patterns, and losses in forms resilient enough to outlast catastrophe. Precision was sacrificed so that meaning could endure. This perspective does not require myth to be literal to be valuable. It only asks that we stop assuming it is useless. When dozens of cultures speak independently of floods, it may not matter whether the floods were global or regional. What matters is that floods were remembered as civilization-ending events. The memory itself implies experience, repeated enough to become foundational. Geology quietly supports this discomfort. Sea levels have risen dramatically since the last glacial maximum, inundating vast coastal plains where early human populations are believed to have concentrated. These landscapes are now inaccessible, their history sealed beneath layers of water and sediment. The absence of evidence on land is often taken as evidence of absence. Yet entire chapters may simply lie underwater unread. Even on land, time is ruthless. Organic materials decay. Metals corrode. Stone erodes. Without constant cultural reinforcement, meaning evaporates faster than matter. A monument without context becomes a curiosity. A tool without lineage becomes an anomaly. And anomalies, when isolated, are often dismissed rather than integrated. There is also the matter of scale. Archaeology works in fragments. It reconstructs holes from shards, patterns from remnants. This methodology is powerful, but is also vulnerable to confirmation bias. When a framework is accepted, new data is often interpreted to fit it. Contradictions are smoothed over, explained away, or postponed. This is not deception. It is human cognition seeking coherence. Yet coherence can become a kind of blindness. If Earth has forgotten civilizations, it is not because their traces are entirely gone. It is because their traces no longer fit comfortably within the story we tell about ourselves. To accept that complex societies may have risen and fallen long before our official dawn would be to accept that progress is not guaranteed, that intelligence does not immunize against collapse, and that memory itself is contingent. This realization carries an unease that goes beyond academic debate. It touches something existential. If forgetting is normal, then permanence is the illusion. If entire worlds can vanish with barely a whisper, then the present moment becomes strangely fragile, balanced between remembrance and eraser. Perhaps this is why the question persists, resurfacing again and again in different forms. How many civilizations has Earth forgotten? Or more quietly still, how many are already slipping beyond the edge of recall even now? The silence does not answer. It simply waits, layered beneath our certainty, patient as stone. The pattern suggested by forgetting begins to feel heavier when the Earth itself is allowed to speak. Not through words, but through layers. Ice cores drilled from polar caps reveal atmospheres older than any human story. Sediment beds show coastlines migrating like slow breaths, advancing and retreating over spans no memory could comfortably hold. In this deep record, stability is the exception. Change is the rule, and civilization, fragile and surface-bound, must exist within these rhythms, whether it understands them or not. There was a time, not so distant in geological terms, when much of what is now ocean was dry land. Vast coastal plains stretched outward from the continents, fertile, temperate, and well-suited for settlement. These places would have offered fresh water, abundant food, and easy travel. They would have attracted early human communities naturally long before agriculture formalized life in land. Yet today, these landscapes are gone. Submerged, their rivers drowned, their shorelines erased, their settlements sealed beneath layers of salt and silt. This alone complicates the archaeological picture. Most ancient cities we study were found because they remained accessible. But accessibility is not a measure of importance. It is an accident of preservation. If earlier societies favored coasts, then the absence of evidence on land tells us very little about the true depth of human organization. The sea has become an archive we have barely begun to read. There are moments when this realization surfaces briefly, only to be set aside. Underwater discoveries hint at structures that appear intentional rather than natural. Submerged stone alignments, terraces, and formations provoke debate, then sink back into obscurity due to the difficulty of study. The ocean does not yield its secrets easily, and what cannot be easily categorized is often left unintegrated. But water is only one eraser. Ice has played a similar role. Glacial advances grind landscapes down to bedrock, destroying surface traces almost completely. Entire regions that might once have supported complex societies were later scoured clean, leaving little more than displaced stones and reshaped valleys. When the ice retreats, the land appears ancient and untouched, though it may have hosted life long before the cold arrived. Climate shifts amplify this effect. The Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions roughly 12,000 years ago, interrupted a period of warming just as human societies were becoming more settled. Its onset was abrupt, its cause still debated. Some point to ocean circulation changes, others to cosmic impacts. What matters is not the mechanism alone, but the result. Ecosystems destabilized, food sources shifted, habitable zones shrank, survival demanded adaptation, not record-keeping. In such conditions, continuity becomes unlikely. A culture focused on endurance does not preserve complexity for posterity. It simplifies. It sheds what cannot be carried forward. Knowledge narrows to what keeps the group alive. Anything beyond that becomes excess, and excess is abandoned first. This may explain why certain forms of knowledge appear suddenly in the record, then disappear just as quickly. Techniques emerge that seem refined, precise, even elegant, only to leave no clear descendants. Stoneworking methods that are never quite replicated. Architectural alignments whose principles are debated but not inherited. These are often treated as isolated achievements. But isolation may be an illusion created by missing context. What if these moments are not beginnings but survivals? What if they represent the last echoes of systems already in decline, fragments carried across a threshold and then forgotten? The Earth offers no annotation for these transitions. It records impact and erosion without commentary. Human interpretation must fill the gaps, and it often does so cautiously, preferring minimal disruption to established timelines. Yet the discomfort remains, especially when the record shows signs of repeated disruption rather than a single formative event. The idea of a single cradle of civilization becomes harder to sustain when examined against planetary dynamics. Earth has undergone countless environmental resets. Each would have tested the resilience of any society living through it. Some would adapt, others would fracture. Many would vanish entirely, leaving no more trace than a brief chemical signature in the soil. This reframes extinction. It is not always dramatic. It can be quiet, gradual, and local. A river shifts course. A monsoon fails. A coastline retreats. Over generations, populations thin, migrate, disperse. Social structures dissolve. Memory fragments. What remains may be a story, abstracted and symbolic, passed down without its original reference points. Such stories endure precisely because they no longer depend on place. Flood myths survive whether or not the water recedes. Fire stories persist long after the ash settles. They become portable memories, carried across landscapes, reshaped by forces larger than any single culture. When these myths are compared across distant regions, their similarities become unsettling. They suggest not a shared imagination, but shared experience. Different languages, different symbols, but the same underlying anxieties. The sense that the world has ended before. The intuition that what exists now is not the first version of itself. To acknowledge this is not to abandon rigor, but to widen perspective. It asks that archaeology and geology be read together, not as separate disciplines, but as complementary witnesses. One speaks of human intention. The other speaks of indifference. Between them lies the story of what survives. And perhaps this is the most unsettling thought of all. Earth does not conspire to erase civilizations. It simply continues. The forgetting is not malicious. It is automatic, relentless, impartial, which leaves a final lingering unease. If forgetting is written into the mechanics of the planet itself, then how exceptional can any civilization truly be? And if earlier worlds have already been folded into stone, ice, and water, what makes us believe our own will not follow the same path quietly, patiently until even the question is forgotten? As the layers of ice and water recede from the imagination, stone remains. Not the fragile remnants of daily life, but the deliberate ones, the kind shaped to endure. Stone does not move easily. It resists time in ways wooden flesh cannot. And yet even stone carries a quiet unease when examined closely enough. Across the world, there are places where stone speaks with a voice that feels out of place. Massive blocks fitted together so precisely that even a blade cannot slip between them. Walls aligned with celestial movements that require long-term observation and careful calculation. Structures positioned on landscapes as if the land itself had been studied, measured, and understood in advance. These are not isolated curiosities. They appear again and again, separated by oceans, cultures, and supposedly incompatible timelines. What unsettles is not their existence, but their timing. According to conventional narratives, many of these structures emerge during periods when societies are assumed to be technologically young, recently transitioned from nomadic life, still experimenting with agriculture. Yet here they are leaving behind architecture that seems to presuppose a level of organization, planning, and mathematical insight that feels disproportionate to their assigned place in history. This tension is often resolved by narrowing interpretation. The builders are described as ingenious but simple, inspired but limited. Their achievements are framed as rare flashes of brilliance rather than the products of accumulated tradition. The implication is subtle but important. These societies did not inherit knowledge. They invented it spontaneously, fully formed, then somehow lost it just as quickly. But this explanation raises more questions than it answers. Knowledge once discovered tends to spread. Techniques evolve rather than vanish. Skills are taught, refined, adapted. When they disappear entirely, it is rarely because they were forgotten casually. Disappearance suggests disruption, a break severe enough to sever transmission altogether. In some cases, later cultures encountered these stoneworks without understanding them. They built around them, atop them, or reinterpreted them through myth. Sacred sites were layered with new meaning. Old functions obscured by reverence. What had once been practical or technical became symbolic. The structure remained, but its purpose drifted out of reach. This is not conjecture. Historical records document societies inheriting ruins they could not replicate. Roman engineers marveled at constructions whose methods they could not fully explain. Medieval builders reused ancient stone without knowing how it had been quarried or transported. These moments are treated as curiosities, but they hint at a deeper pattern. Civilization does not always advance by replacement. Sometimes it advances by occupation, stepping into spaces left behind by others. The stone itself complicates matters further. Some blocks are sourced from quarries located miles away, across difficult terrain. Their transportation would have required coordinated labor, logistical planning, and an understanding of physics that goes beyond trial and error. Others show evidence of shaping techniques that leave marks still debated today. Not impossible marks, just unresolved ones. When these features are examined individually, they can be rationalized. When viewed collectively, they begin to feel less like anomalies and more like residues. Traces of systems that once functioned coherently, then fractured. The idea that early societies were incapable of complex thought is increasingly difficult to sustain. Cognitive capacity did not suddenly ignite a few thousand years ago. Anatomically, modern humans existed long before the structures attributed to them. If the mind was already capable, what restrained it? Environment, opportunity, continuity, all of which are vulnerable to disruption. Stone structures then may not represent beginnings. They may represent survivals, the last expressions of traditions already ancient by the time they were carved. If earlier phases were built of materials less durable, their disappearance would be complete, leaving stone as the only witness. This possibility shifts the emotional weight of these sites. They're no longer triumphs emerging from simplicity, but echoes persisting after loss. Standing stones become punctuation marks at the end of forgotten sentences. Monuments become memorials not to individuals, but to ways of understanding the world that did not endure. There is also the matter of alignment. Many ancient stone sites demonstrate precise relationships with solar, lunar, or stellar cycles. These relationships require long-term observation across generations. They imply continuity. One cannot map cycles without remaining in place long enough to notice repetition. This suggests stability preceding construction, not chaos. Yet history often places these achievements immediately after periods of upheaval, as if societies emerge from disruption already equipped with cosmological frameworks. This inversion is rarely addressed directly. It is simply accepted. The earth does not correct us. Stone does not argue. It waits. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of these structures is how little they demand belief. They exist regardless of interpretation. One does not need to attribute impossible technologies or external intervention to feel unease. The unease arises naturally from timing, precision, and absence. From the sense that what we are seeing is incomplete. If civilizations have been forgotten, stone may be the most honest remnant they left behind. Honest because it cannot explain itself. Honest because it resists narrative. It does not tell us who built it or why. It only tells us that someone did with intention, skill, and time. And time, as the earth repeatedly demonstrates, is the one resource civilizations never truly control. As these stone witnesses endure, they pose a quiet challenge not to rewrite history recklessly, but to loosen its grip, to allow the possibility that what we call origins may be thresholds instead. That beneath the visible foundations of civilization lie deeper strata, pressed flat by catastrophe, erosion, and forgetting. If stone remembers longer than people, then perhaps the question is not how much we have learned from it, but how much it has been trying to tell us without words, and whether we are willing to listen before our own marks too become mute. The stone endures, but sequence does not. When archaeologists arrange the past, they rely on order. Layers stacked neatly, one period giving way to the next. Yet there are moments when this order fractures. Cultures appear without childhoods. Cities rise with no visible rehearsal. Systems of belief, measurement, and governance arrive already mature, as if they had been carried in rather than grown in place. This phenomenon is often described cautiously, wrapped in neutral language. A civilization is said to have emerged rapidly. Its origins are labeled unclear. Development is described as compressed. These phrases soften the discomfort without resolving it. They acknowledge the gap while quietly stepping around it. Consider the sudden appearance of fully articulated urban life. Dense populations organized around agriculture, trade, and ritual. Specialized labor, long-distance exchange networks, symbolic systems that encode law, cosmology, and authority. These are not trivial achievements. They require time, experimentation, failure, and transmission. And yet, in multiple regions, they seem to arrive almost simultaneously without visible predecessors at the same scale. One explanation suggests that earlier stages simply have not been found yet. This is reasonable but incomplete. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Yet repeated absence across wide regions invites deeper scrutiny, especially when later phases are preserved so abundantly. Why would the fragile beginnings vanish so thoroughly, while the more complex expressions survive? Another explanation proposes that development occurred elsewhere and was imported. Knowledge travels. People migrate, techniques spread. This too is plausible, but it displaces rather than resolves the mystery. If complexity arrived from somewhere else, then that somewhere must itself be explained. The question simply moves outward into darker territory. The discomfort intensifies when abrupt disappearance follows abrupt emergence. Entire systems vanish. Writing systems are abandoned. Urban centers empty. Technologies cease to be used. The people do not vanish entirely, but their complexity does. Later cultures often occupy the same spaces with simpler tools and smaller populations, as if something essential had been lost and could not be recovered. These are not isolated collapses. They recur across continents and millennia. Each is explained locally, attributed to drought, invasion, disease, or mismanagement. All reasonable factors. Yet when viewed together, they suggest vulnerability rather than inevitability. Civilization appears less like a stable achievement and more like a delicate configuration, easily disrupted and difficult to restore. This fragility undermines the assumption that progress naturally accumulates. If knowledge were self-sustaining, collapse would slow it, not erase it. But the record suggests erasure happens more often than continuity. Skills disappear entirely. Techniques are reinvented later, sometimes differently, sometimes less efficiently. Memory does not always survive disruption. This brings attention to a rarely discussed element: institutional memory. Knowledge does not live in individuals alone. It lives in systems, in education, in shared practice, in social trust. When these systems fracture, knowledge does not merely pause, it dissolves. And once dissolved, it cannot be reconstructed from fragments alone. The archaeological record occasionally reveals this dissolution in reverse. Later, peoples encountering artifacts whose purpose they no longer understand. Objects become ritualized, mythologized, stripped of function, and filled with meaning. What was once practical becomes sacred. What was once precise becomes symbolic. This transition preserves the artifact while erasing its context. It is here that time begins to fold in on itself. The same pattern repeats. Complexity arises, disruption intervenes, simplicity follows, memory contracts, and somewhere beneath these cycles, earlier layers remain unexamined, either because they're gone or because they no longer resemble what we expect to find. Expectation itself becomes a filter. Archaeology searches for what it recognizes: stone tools, pottery, architecture. But if earlier civilizations expressed complexity differently through materials less durable or systems less centralized, their traces would not announce themselves clearly. They would blur into the background of prehistory, misclassified as natural or incidental. There is also the matter of scale. Civilization does not require monumental architecture to be sophisticated. Knowledge can exist without stone. Navigation, astronomy, medicine, and ecological management leave faint footprints unless deliberately preserved. A society optimized for resilience, rather than display, might leave almost nothing behind once displaced. This possibility challenges the hierarchy embedded in historical interpretation. What is remembered tends to be what was loud, large, and centralized. What is forgotten may have been quiet, adaptive, and dispersed. If so, forgetting is not merely accidental. It is selective. Written history amplifies this selectivity. Writing favors elites, administrators, and centralized authority. Societies that relied on oral transmission or decentralized knowledge networks would appear mute by comparison. Their disappearance would look like absence rather than loss. And yet oral cultures are not inherently fragile. They can preserve memory for astonishing lengths of time, but only under continuity. Break that continuity, and the memory collapses rapidly. A single generation of disruption can undo centuries of careful transmission. This may explain why so many cultures speak of ancestors who knew more than they did. Not as nostalgia, but as observation, a recognition that something had been severed, that wisdom had been reduced, not expanded. Seen this way, the archaeological gaps stop feeling random. They begin to feel structural. Civilization does not climb steadily upward. It pulses. It swells and recedes. And each recession scrapes away layers of knowledge, leaving only partial impressions behind. If Earth has forgotten civilizations, it may not be because they failed. It may be because they were interrupted at the wrong moment. Caught between complexity and collapse, with no time to anchor their memory in materials that could endure. The unsettling implication is this: what we identify as beginnings may simply be the earlier survivals, the first moments that escaped erasure by chance rather than design. And if that is true, then the silence before them is not empty. It is crowded with lives, systems, and understandings that never learned how to outlast the planet they inhabited. The silence left by vanished sequences deepens when attention turns outward toward the edges of the continents. Civilization, as it is usually imagined, is terrestrial and anchored. Fields, walls, cities fixed to land. Yet for most of human existence, land was not the only stable surface. Coastline shifted slowly enough to be lived upon, and water was not a boundary but a corridor. The earliest human migrations followed shorelines. Food was abundant there. Navigation required no roads. Travel was easier by water than through dense forests or rugged terrain. If early societies developed complexity, it would have been natural for them to do so along coasts, not as cities in the modern sense, but as networks fluid, adaptive, and mobile. Today, those landscapes are gone. Since the end of the last ice age, sea levels have risen by more than 100 m. Entire continental shelves were submerged. Plains larger than many modern countries vanished beneath the ocean. Rivers became estuaries. Settlements, if they existed, were claimed silently by water. No invasion, no fire, just steady encroachment. What makes this loss particularly difficult to integrate is that archaeology is largely blind beneath the sea. Excavation on land is already complex and expensive. Underwater research is exponentially more so. As a result, the earliest chapters of coastal human activity remain speculative, their absence mistaken for insignificance. Yet occasional discoveries disrupt this assumption. Submerged stone features off various coasts raise uncomfortable questions. Are they natural formations shaped by chance, or intentional construction shaped by hands? Debate lingers, often unresolved, not because answers are impossible, but because the methods required to reach them are still rare. This methodological limitation quietly shapes narrative. What cannot be studied easily is rarely emphasized. Over time, it fades from the collective imagination, replaced by stories that fit accessible evidence. The sea becomes a void rather than an archive. But the sea preserves as well as it erases. Organic materials decay slowly in cold and oxic conditions. Structures collapse but do not vanish entirely. Patterns remain. Alignments persist. The difficulty lies not in absence, but in interpretation. If earlier civilizations were coastal, their disappearance would look complete from the landward perspective. Inland societies might arise later, unaware of what came before, inheriting a world already stripped of its earlier centers. Their myths of lost lands and sunken worlds would not be allegories. They would be memories refracted through generations. Across cultures, stories of lands swallowed by water occur with remarkable consistency. They are not uniform, but they rhyme. A prosperous place, a transgression or imbalance, a sudden inundation, survivors who carry fragments of knowledge elsewhere. These narratives are often treated as moral tales, but their persistence hints at experiential roots. Geology does not contradict them. Meltwater pulses were rapid and dramatic. Coastlines could retreat miles within a human lifetime. For communities anchored to the shore, this would have felt like the end of the world, and for knowledge systems tied to place, it would have been exactly that. There is also the matter of navigation. Seafaring requires sophisticated understanding of winds, currents, stars, and seasonal patterns. These skills do not develop overnight. They accumulate through practice and observation. If ancient peoples possessed such knowledge, it would not leave obvious traces on land. Boats decay. Navigation leaves no ruins. Yet the knowledge itself could shape culture profoundly. A maritime civilization would look invisible to traditional archaeology. Its cities would be temporary. Its monuments would be the horizon. Its memory would travel with people rather than remain fixed in stone. Once displaced, it would leave behind little more than stories. This invisibility has consequences. When later land-based civilizations emerged, they may have inherited fragments of maritime knowledge without understanding its origins. Navigation myths, star law, cosmologies oriented towards cycles rather than borders. These fragments would be reinterpreted, localized, and eventually detached from their source. Over time, the source itself would be forgotten. The ocean then may not merely conceal ruins. It may conceal context, a way of organizing life that does not align with the assumptions of sedentary civilization, a model of complexity that thrives on movement rather than permanence. This possibility reframes the question of forgotten civilizations. Forgetting does not require collapse. It only requires displacement. When the sea rises, people move. When people move, continuity fractures. Memory survives only where it can adapt. The land-based societies that followed may have believed themselves to be pioneers, first builders, first organizers, first thinkers. Without visible predecessors, they would assume originality. Their certainty would harden into tradition, then doctrine. Meanwhile, beneath the waves, the earliest chapters would wait. The deeper implication is unsettling. If the earliest complex human systems were maritime and coastal, then much of what we think we know about origins is skewed by preservation bias. We are studying what survived, not what mattered most at the time. This does not require rewriting history recklessly. It only asks for humility, for recognition that the archive is incomplete by design, shaped by forces indifferent to human memory. Perhaps Earth has not only forgotten civilizations, perhaps it has hidden them in places we're only just learning how to look. And as the water continues to rise, even now reshaping coastlines once again, the question acquires a quiet urgency. Are we repeating a pattern older than memory? Trusting that our own traces will endure even as the sea reminds us how easily worlds slip out of reach. What the sea takes from stone memory sometimes keeps in voice. When physical traces thin, stories grow heavier, carrying more than they appear to hold. Oral traditions, myths, epics, and ritual narratives persist in places where written records never formed or could not survive. They do not behave like archives, yet they endure with a stubbornness that invites attention. Across continents and cultures, certain themes recur with a precision that feels unsettling. Not identical plots, but shared structures. A time before the present order, beings or ancestors who possessed greater knowledge. A rupture, a fall. Survivors who remember fragments but not the whole. These patterns appear among societies separated by oceans and millennia, societies that could not have borrowed directly from one another. Modern thought often treats these similarities as evidence of universal psychology. Humans, it said, tell the same stories because they fear the same things. Floods, fires, darkness, chaos. This explanation is not false, but it may be incomplete. Fear alone does not explain detail. It does not explain why some myths encode specific astronomical cycles, geographic features, or ecological changes that align with real events long past. There are oral traditions that describe coastlines when none exist today, rivers that no longer flow, animals that vanished at the end of the last ice age. In some cases, these descriptions match geological reconstructions with striking accuracy. This does not mean the stories are literal records. It means they are durable memories reshaped but not erased. The endurance of such memory challenges assumptions about pre-iterate societies. Oral transmission is often portrayed as unreliable, prone to distortion. Yet studies of living oral cultures suggest the opposite. When a story is embedded in ritual identity and survival, it can persist with remarkable stability. Change is controlled. Innovation is resisted. Memory becomes a collective responsibility. What threatens oral memory is not time but disruption, forced migration, cultural collapse, language loss. When continuity breaks, oral systems unravel quickly. A few generations are enough to turn detailed remembrance into abstraction. Symbols remain, meaning thins. This may explain why so many myths feel incomplete. They gesture towards something larger, then dissolve into metaphor. Listeners sense that something is missing, but cannot name it. The story survives, but its context does not. Written history, by contrast, appears more precise, but is often more selective. Writing freezes memory, but it also filters it. What is recorded reflects power, not totality. Administrative needs outweigh existential ones. Daily life disappears. Peripheral knowledge fades. What survives is what mattered to institutions. When writing systems collapse, the loss is immediate and severe. Entire literatures vanish. Calendars reset. Chronologies fracture. New regimes overwrite old ones. Sometimes deliberately, sometimes by neglect. The past becomes fragmented, accessible only through remnants that escape erasure. This interplay between oral memory and written authority creates blind spots. Myths are dismissed as fiction. Texts are treated as fact. Yet myths often preserve what texts never recorded, while texts often distort what myths remember. When the two are read separately, both mislead. When read together, something more complex emerges. There are moments when this convergence becomes difficult to ignore. Ancient narratives that describe long cycles of time align uncannily with astronomical patterns. Stories of repeated destructions mirror evidence of periodic environmental upheaval. Accounts of knowledge-bearing ancestors coincide with sudden cultural leaps in the archaeological record. These correspondences do not prove forgotten civilizations. They suggest forgotten experiences. Experiences significant enough to be remembered symbolically when material continuity failed. The reluctance to engage with this possibility stems partly from methodology. History prefers documents. Archaeology prefers artifacts. Myth occupies an uncomfortable space between disciplines. It resists measurement. It does not submit easily to chronology. As a result, it is often sidelined. Yet sidelining myth may cost more than is acknowledged. It removes the emotional record of catastrophe, the human perspective, the lived experience of collapse. Stone can tell us that a city fell. Myth can tell us what it felt like to watch the world end. This emotional dimension matters. It shapes behavior across generations. Societies that remember collapse behave differently. They encode caution. They ritualize balance. They warn against hubris. These are not abstract morals. They are survival strategies. If earlier civilizations endured disruptions severe enough to fracture continuity, their survivors would not preserve blueprints or technical manuals. They would preserve warnings, lessons abstracted into story. Do not anger the waters. Do not ignore the sky. Do not forget the cycles. Over time, these warnings lose specificity. They become morality tales, religious narratives, philosophical allegories. Their origin fades, but their structure persists. Seen this way, myth is not the opposite of history. It is history after trauma. This reframing complicates the question of forgetting. Civilization may be forgotten materially, while remembered emotionally. Its technologies lost, its city submerged or eroded, but its anxieties carried forward. The sense that the world has ended before, that stability is temporary, that knowledge can be lost. Such intuitions are difficult to quantify, but they recur with persistence that suggests inheritance rather than invention. If Earth has forgotten civilizations, perhaps it has not forgotten their endings. Perhaps those endings echo quietly through myth, shaping human imagination long after their causes have vanished. The challenge is not to literalize these stories, nor to dismiss them. It is to listen to what they preserve beneath metaphor, to ask why the same shadows fall across so many different narratives, to wonder whether these shadows are cast by events too large to be remembered directly. And if that is the case, then the myths we tell are not distractions from history. They are its after-images. What then are we remembering without knowing it? And what warnings are embedded in these ancient stories that we no longer recognize as relevant simply because we believe ourselves to be beyond the reach of forgetting? The echoes carried by myth gain a sharper edge when examined alongside evidence of sudden disruption. Not the slow, patient changes of erosion or cultural drift, but abrupt events that fracture continuity so completely that recovery becomes unlikely. These moments appear in the record as scars rather than transitions, brief and violent interruptions that leave little time for adaptation. Earth history is punctuated by such shocks. Volcanic eruptions capable of darkening skies across continents. Impacts that inject dust and fire into the atmosphere. Sudden climate reversals that transform fertile regions into inhospitable terrain within a generation. These are not speculative scenarios. They're documented in ash layers, crater fields, isotope anomalies, and abrupt shifts in temperature proxies. What remains debated is not whether such events occurred, but how often they intersected with human presence and how deeply they disrupted social complexity. The Younger Dryas stands as one of the most unsettling examples, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions after a period of warming, arriving with little warning and lasting over a millennium. Ecosystems reorganized rapidly. Large animals vanished. Human populations were forced to adapt to colder, drier conditions, just as they were beginning to settle more permanently. The cause of this event is still contested. Some point to changes in ocean circulation. Others suggest extraterrestrial influence, citing impact markers and widespread burn layers. The debate itself is less important than the implication. A stable world can destabilize suddenly, and when it does, societies organized around predictability suffer first. Such disruptions do not need to annihilate humanity to erase civilizations. They only need to interrupt the conditions that sustain complexity. Agriculture fails. Trade routes collapse. Populations fragment. Specialized knowledge becomes impractical. Under stress, survival favors generalists over specialists, immediacy over abstraction. This process leaves a distinctive signature. Advanced tools disappear. Long-distance exchange ceases. Symbolic expression simplifies. Writing, if it exists, vanishes quickly. Within a few generations, a society that once coordinated thousands of people may be reduced to small mobile groups focused on subsistence. From the outside, it appears as regression. From within, it is adaptation. The problem arises when recovery is incomplete. When conditions stabilize, survivors may rebuild, but not necessarily from where they left off. Knowledge lost during the collapse cannot be easily reconstructed. It must be rediscovered, often differently. The resulting civilization may share geography with its predecessor, but not continuity. This pattern appears repeatedly, cultures flourishing, then thinning, networks expanding, then dissolving. Each time, the archaeological record's a break rather than a bridge. These breaks are often explained locally, but their global distribution suggests something broader at work. Catastrophe has a way of synchronizing history. A large enough event does not respect borders. It compresses timelines across regions, creating simultaneous endings. If multiple civilizations were lost around the same periods, their absence would reinforce one another. No survivors would remain with the capacity to remember the whole. This synchronization may explain why some periods feel strangely empty, why the record shows long stretches of relative simplicity following bursts of innovation. These are not necessarily signs of slow development. They may be the long aftermaths of collective trauma. Trauma reshapes memory. It does not preserve detail. It preserves emotion, fear, loss, reverence. Stories of fire, darkness, and cleansing emerge not because they are dramatic, but because they are accurate reflections of experience abstracted into survivable form. There is also the matter of scale. Modern civilization has not experienced a truly global collapse. Wars are localized. Pandemics strain systems, but rarely erase them entirely. As a result, it is easy to underestimate how fragile global coherence truly is. Past civilizations may not have had the redundancy we rely upon today. A single catastrophic event layered atop existing stress could undo centuries of accumulated knowledge. And once undone, it would not announce itself as loss. It would simply become the new normal. The absence would feel original to those born into it. This raises a difficult question. How many of the firsts we celebrate are actually second attempts? How many foundational inventions were rediscoveries rather than breakthroughs? The archaeological record does not easily distinguish between innovation and recovery. Both leave similar traces. Catastrophe blurs origin. When viewed through this lens, the question of forgotten civilizations becomes less speculative and more structural. Civilization is not a permanent state. It is a temporary alignment of environment, knowledge, and cooperation. When that alignment fails, collapse follows not as punishment but as consequence. Earth does not preserve intent. It preserves outcome. The unsettling implication is that forgetting may be cyclical. Each collapse erases context, leaving survivors to rebuild without awareness of what preceded them. Over time, these cycles flatten history, compressing vast complexity into a few visible peaks, separated by long valleys of silence. If this is true, then the apparent youth of civilization is misleading. What appears as a beginning may be a resurfacing. What we call progress may be recovery slowed by amnesia. The final unease lingers quietly. If catastrophe has repeatedly reset civilization before, not through extinction but through interruption, then the present moment is not unprecedented. It is familiar whether we remember it or not. And if forgetting follows collapse as reliably as collapse follows instability, then the question shifts again. Not how many civilizations Earth has forgotten, but how close we are to becoming one more layer beneath the surface, remembered only in fragments, if at all. After catastrophe thins the record, something else quietly shapes what remains. Not the Earth this time, but human choice. Memory does not survive on its own. It is curated, preserved, copied, and taught. And every act of preservation is also an act of selection. History, as it reaches us, is not a neutral inheritance. It is an archive assembled by institutions, often long after the events they describe. Empires gather documents. Religions codify narratives. States decide which texts are copied and which are allowed to decay. Over generations, these choices harden into authority. What survives feels inevitable. What is lost feels unreal. This process rarely announces itself as control. It presents as order, as coherence, as the natural organization of knowledge. Yet beneath that surface lies a quieter truth. The past we know is the past that fit within the priorities of those who held power when memory was fragile. Written history favors stability. It prefers continuity, legitimacy, succession. Records are kept to justify rule, define borders, collect taxes, and maintain belief. Events that complicate these aims are often simplified or omitted, not always maliciously, often unconsciously. Chaos does not copy well. When civilizations collapse and new systems rise in their place, rewriting is almost unavoidable. New authorities inherit fragments of the old and rearrange them to support the present. Timelines are compressed. Origins are clarified. Ambiguity is reduced. The past becomes useful. This tendency is visible even in well-documented eras. Dynasties just genealogies. Victors frame defeats as necessary sacrifices. Religious reforms reinterpret older practices as corruptions rather than continuations. Over time, these reinterpretations replace memory itself. Now imagine this process operating not over centuries, but over millennia following repeated collapses. Each reset would narrow the archive further. Each reconstruction would simplify origins. Each generation would assume it stood closer to the beginning than it actually did. In such a context, forgetting does not require a conspiracy. It emerges naturally from survival and administration. Complexity is heavy. It is expensive to preserve. Simplicity travels farther. This is especially true for knowledge that does not serve immediate governance. Technical expertise without obvious application. Cosmological models that challenge prevailing beliefs. Accounts of earlier societies that undermine claims of uniqueness. These are fragile forms of memory. They survive only when actively protected. Throughout history, moments of intense centralization coincide with narrowing of acceptable knowledge. Libraries are curated. Texts are standardized. Alternative chronologies are dismissed as myth. What does not align is labeled heretical, unscientific, or irrelevant. The effect is cumulative. Each generation inherits a past already filtered. Even archaeology is not immune to this process. Funding priorities shape research questions. Sites that promise clarity are favored over those that raise discomfort. Discoveries that fit existing frameworks are integrated quickly. Those that do not often linger on the margins, debated quietly, rarely emphasized. This is not deception. It is momentum. Institutions are designed to stabilize narratives, not destabilize them. Acknowledging deep uncertainty threatens coherence, and coherence is what institutions exist to provide. Yet coherence comes at a cost. When the past is smoothed, its fractures disappear. Discontinuities become footnotes. Anomalies become curiosities. Over time, the sense that history might be layered, interrupted, or cyclical fades. A linear story replaces a complex one. This linearity is comforting. It implies progress. It suggests that humanity is moving somewhere rather than circling. It reassures us that knowledge accumulates rather than resets. But comfort is not evidence. There are hints, scattered and subtle, that earlier scholars were more comfortable with uncertainty than we assume. Ancient chronologies often extend further back than modern ones. Some early historians described cycles of destruction and renewal without embarrassment. These ideas were later streamlined, their implications softened. Why this shift occurred is not mysterious. As scientific methods improved, confidence increased. Precision replaced speculation. Timelines shortened to what could be measured reliably. What could not be dated precisely was pushed aside. Caution hardened into dismissal. The unintended result was amputation. Large portions of human possibility were cut away. Not because they were disproven, but because they were difficult to integrate. This leaves us with a paradox. We possess more data than ever before. Yet our acceptable window of history feels narrower. We know more about the last few thousand years than any generation before us, yet remain oddly uncomfortable with what might lie beyond. If forgotten civilizations existed, their absence would challenge more than chronology. It would challenge authority. It would suggest that institutions tasked with preserving truth are also participants in forgetting. Not villains, but inheritors of a system that rewards stability over doubt. This realization need not breed cynicism. It can breed humility, the recognition that history is provisional. that what feels complete may only be the most recent layer. Memory, after all, is not a fixed object. It is an ongoing negotiation between what survives, what is valued, and what is allowed to matter. When conditions change, memory changes with them. The unsettling possibility is that entire epics may have been filtered out not by malice, but by relevance. They did not serve the needs of those who came after, and so they faded. If Earth has forgotten civilizations, human systems may have helped, not by destroying evidence, but by failing to recognize its importance when it briefly surfaced. By allowing discomfort to become dismissal, by mistaking silence for emptiness. The question that lingers is not whether this has happened before, but whether it is happening still as new discoveries emerge, as anomalies surface and are set aside. What future narratives are being shaped by present choices? Because forgetting is not only an ancient process, it is ongoing. And what we decide to remember now will determine how complete our own story appears to those who come after us. Assuming anyone remains to ask the question at all. When memory narrows, objects become strange. They sit outside the flow of explanation, resisting placement, demanding attention without offering context. These are the artifacts that appear briefly in the record, then vanish, leaving no clear line of inheritance behind them. They do not announce lost civilizations outright. They whisper discontinuity. There are tools whose sophistication feels oddly localized. Techniques that solve specific problems with remarkable efficiency, yet fail to propagate. Methods that seem optimized rather than experimental. When encountered, they often treated as ingenious anomalies, flashes of brilliance unconnected to broader systems. But ingenuity, when embedded in culture, rarely stands alone. It spreads, adapts, and mutates. Its sudden disappearance suggests interruption rather than exhaustion. The discomfort here lies not in any single object, but in pattern. Across different regions and periods, similar moments recur. A technique emerges that appears refined beyond its context. It leaves behind few mistakes, little evidence of trial and error. Then it stops. Later cultures do not improve upon it. They replace it with something simpler or different, as if the thread had snapped. This challenges a familiar assumption. We tend to believe that technology evolves cumulatively, that once a method proves useful, it persists. But this belief depends on continuity. It assumes stable transmission across generations. Remove that stability, and usefulness alone is not enough. Consider how easily specialized knowledge can vanish even in modern systems. When expertise is concentrated, when training is limited, when conditions change suddenly, entire fields can collapse within decades. Without institutional support, memory evaporates. Tools become incomprehensible. Manuals become artifacts. In the distant past, this fragility would have been far greater. Knowledge was embodied rather than abstracted. Techniques lived in hands and habits, not diagrams. When practitioners disappeared, their skills went with them. What remained were the products, mute and misleading. This may explain why some artifacts appear technologically advanced, but culturally isolated. They're not evidence of widespread superiority. They are remnants of specialization, the last outputs of systems that no longer existed by the time we encountered them. From the outside, they feel premature. From the inside, they may have been late. The temptation is to interpret these objects as evidence of external intervention or singular genius. These explanations are seductive because they resolve discomfort quickly. They restore linearity. A mystery becomes an exception. But exceptions do not accumulate this way. When anomalies cluster, they ask to be reclassified. Reclassification does not require speculation beyond evidence. It requires recontextualization. Instead of asking how a primitive society could produce something advanced, one might ask what kind of society could produce it briefly, then fail to transmit it. The answer does not lie in capability, but in continuity. Transmission is the quiet engine of civilization. Without it, progress resets. Each generation becomes an island. Knowledge must be rediscovered rather than inherited. In such a world, advancement is episodic, not cumulative. Peaks rise, then flatten. The archaeological record is full of such flattened peaks. There is also the problem of visibility. What we notice tends to be what surprises us. Objects that fit expectations blend into background noise. Anomalies stand out precisely because they resist easy explanation. But visibility is not proportional to importance. It is proportional to contrast. A forgotten civilization might leave behind a handful of striking objects and vast fields of ordinary ones indistinguishable from later tools. Over time, only the strange would attract attention. The rest would be absorbed into generic categories. The civilization itself would dissolve into a statistical blur. This selective visibility creates an illusion of isolation. It makes remnants feel disconnected when they may once have been integral parts of coherent systems. We encounter the punctuation, not the sentence. There are also cases where technologies appear to move sideways rather than forward. Solutions optimized for specific environments vanish when those environments change. A society adapted to a particular climate, resource base, or social structure may produce tools unsuited to new conditions. When disruption occurs, these tools become liabilities rather than assets. They're abandoned deliberately. From a later perspective, this looks like regression. In reality, it is triage. This reframing matters because it alters how we interpret loss. Lost technology does not imply ignorance. It implies change, a shift in priorities enforced by circumstance. Survival does not always reward sophistication. If forgotten civilizations existed, their technological footprints would not resemble modern progress. They would be uneven, context-specific, and discontinuous. They would leave behind puzzles rather than blueprints. These puzzles provoke unease because they hint at alternative trajectories, paths taken and abandoned, experiments conducted and terminated. Not all futures converge on the present. This realization destabilizes confidence inevitability. It suggests that what we consider advanced may be contingent, that what we preserve is shaped by chance as much as by merit. When faced with anomalous artifacts, the safest response is often dismissal. Labeling something an outlier protects the larger narrative. It preserves coherence, but coherence achieved through exclusion is fragile. It cracks under accumulation. As more anomalies surface, the pressure to integrate them grows. Integration does not mean affirmation. It means allowing complexity to remain unresolved. It means resisting the urge to compress history into a single line. If Earth has forgotten civilizations, their technologies may not announce themselves clearly. They may appear as brief interruptions, misaligned with expectation, then fade. Their significance lies not in what they prove, but in what they imply. That knowledge can be both advanced and temporary. That sophistication does not guarantee survival. And perhaps that is the most unsettling implication of all. Not that civilizations are forgotten, but that forgetting is efficient. That even remarkable achievements can slip out of reach when the structures that support them collapse. If this has happened before, then the artifacts we struggle to explain are not embarrassments to be explained away. They are warnings, quiet reminders that continuity is fragile, and that without it even the most refined understanding becomes a dead end. The question lingers softly unresolved. How many such dead ends lie scattered beneath our feet, misread as curiosities rather than remnants? And how many of our own achievements will appear just as puzzling, just as isolated when the context that gives them meaning finally dissolves? There is a moment in the human story that feels less like growth and more like a jump, not a gradual incline, but a sudden change in angle. Symbols appear. Art becomes abstract. Language seems to thicken, capable of carrying metaphor, recursion, and layered meaning. Social structures grow more complex almost overnight, at least by archaeological standards. This moment is often described as a cognitive awakening, a flowering of the modern mind. Yet the timing of this shift is uneasy. Anatomically, modern humans existed long before this surge. Brains of the same size, the same structure, walked the Earth tens of thousands of years earlier. They hunted, migrated, adapted, and survived across diverse environments. If capacity was already present, why did expression wait? Why did complexity hesitate, then arrive in clusters? One explanation attributes this change to gradual accumulation reaching a threshold. Language refined itself. Social density increased. Symbolic behavior finally crossed into visibility. This narrative is tidy, but it leaves gaps. Thresholds do not usually appear everywhere at once. Yet similar leaps occur across wide regions within surprisingly narrow windows of time. Another explanation points to environmental stability. When conditions improve, creativity flourishes. When survival pressures ease, cognition turns outward. There is truth here as well, but it does not fully account for the sharpness of the shift. Nor does it explain why earlier periods of stability did not produce the same effect. There is an alternative way of reading this pattern, one that is quieter and more unsettling. What if the leap is not an awakening, but a recovery? Not the birth of something new, but the reemergence of something interrupted. If earlier cycles of civilization existed, even at modest scales, their collapse would not erase human capability. It would erase continuity. Knowledge would fragment, skills would narrow, symbolic systems would simplify. Over time, complexity would thin to what could be carried forward without infrastructure. In such a scenario, what looks like sudden innovation might actually be recollection under new conditions. Not memory in the literal sense, but resonance. Patterns rediscovered because they once worked. Structures rebuilt because they fit the mind as it already existed. This does not require inherited blueprints. It requires inherited capacity, meeting opportunity. Again, the archaeological record offers hints consistent with this interpretation. Some of the earliest symbolic artifacts appear remarkably confident, not tentative, not experimental. They do not look like first attempts. They look like continuations, as if the language of abstraction was already familiar, merely waiting for the right conditions to surface. This confidence is difficult to quantify, but it is felt. The difference between stumbling and speaking fluently, between improvisation and recognition. There are also long periods of apparent stagnation that follow these bursts. Innovation surges, then slows. Complexity expands, then plateaus. This rhythm does not resemble a smooth ascent. It resembles pulses, advances clustered in time, separated by stretches of relative quiet. Biology, too, resists the idea of sudden transformation without precedent. Evolution shapes capacity slowly. It does not install features overnight. If the human brain was capable of complex symbolic thought, it was capable long before it displayed it archaeologically. The delay demands explanation. Some researchers point to cultural bottlenecks. Population size matters. Social networks must reach a certain density before ideas can stabilize and propagate. When populations fragment, innovation stalls. When they reconnect, it accelerates. This aligns with the idea of recovery rather than origin. Under this view, cognitive leaps are not miracles. They are reassemblies. Trauma may play a role as well. Catastrophe reshapes behavior. It strips away excess and enforces new priorities. In the aftermath, survivors often reorganize meaning. Ritual emerges. Art intensifies. Storytelling deepens. These are not luxuries. They are tools for coherence in a fractured world. If early humans endured repeated disruptions, symbolic behavior might have surged in response, not as entertainment, but a stabilization. A way to bind groups together, to encode lessons, to create continuity where physical structures failed. This would explain why symbolism appears both suddenly and with gravity. It is not playful. It is serious, concerned with life, death, cycles, and forces beyond control. It carries the weight of experience. Modern interpretations often frame this period as humanity's first awakening to itself. But perhaps it was not the first time. Perhaps it was the first time that awakening survived long enough to leave a durable trace. This reframing shifts the emotional tone of early art and language. They become acts of preservation rather than discovery, efforts to anchor meaning in a world known to be unstable. There is also the question of why these cognitive surges are followed by long intervals of forgetting. If intelligence had simply ignited, why did it dim repeatedly? Why did complexity need to be rediscovered again and again? Because intelligence alone is not enough. It requires scaffolding. Without stable systems, even the most capable minds cannot sustain complexity across generations. They adapt downward. They simplify. They survive. Seen this way, humanity's story becomes less triumphant and more resilient. Not a straight march toward enlightenment, but a repeated effort to rebuild coherence after loss. Each attempt shaped by what remained and what was forgotten. If Earth has forgotten civilizations, then the human mind may carry their faint imprint, not as explicit memory, but as structure, as recurring tendencies, as questions that resurface unbidden. Why do we imagine earlier golden ages? Why do we sense that knowledge can be lost as easily as it is gained? Why do so many traditions warn against arrogance, as if remembering something already learned the hard way? Perhaps these intuitions are not philosophical abstractions. Perhaps they are echoes not of specific events, but of repeated experience. If cognitive leaps are recoveries rather than births, then our own moment may not be as unprecedented as it feels. We may be standing on a familiar ridge, looking outward with the same confidence others once had. Unaware of how many times the view has appeared before, the unsettling thought remains. If memory fades but capacity persists, then civilization can return without remembering why it fell. It can repeat mistakes without recognizing them. It can mistake familiarity for novelty. And if that is true, then the most dangerous loss is not of technology or structure, but of awareness. The awareness that what feels new may be fragile, and what feels permanent may already be dissolving. When memory falters and continuity breaks, geography becomes unreliable. Maps which seem so concrete, so authoritative, begin to behave like myths. They preserve outlines, directions, and relationships. Yet sometimes they do so with an accuracy that feels out of place, as if drawn from knowledge that should not have been available at the time. There are ancient maps that trouble historians not because they are obviously wrong, but because they are unexpectedly precise, coastlines that resemble modern surveys more than medieval guesswork. Proportions that suggest careful measurement rather than symbolic representation. Details that align with landscapes altered or erased long before the era in which the maps were supposedly created. These artifacts are often explained cautiously. Later copies of earlier originals, educated guesses refined by sailors' reports, coincidence amplified by selective interpretation. Each explanation is reasonable on its own. Yet taken together, they leave a residue of unease. Precision-like complexity rarely appears without lineage. Seagraphy is not merely drawing. It is the culmination of repeated observation, standardized reference points, and shared conventions. It requires continuity, knowledge passed carefully from one generation to the next. When such continuity is absent, maps become abstract, distorted, or symbolic. Accuracy is the reward of stability. This makes certain ancient representations difficult to place. Some seem to encode information about regions not accessible to the cultures credited with producing them. Others depict features that would have required either extensive exploration or inherited knowledge. The question is not whether these maps are perfect. It is why they are as good as they are. There is also the matter of orientation. Many early maps are not centered where later power structures would expect. They prioritize coastlines, currents, and passages over political boundaries. Land is framed in relation to water rather than authority. This perspective feels older, shaped by movement rather than control. If earlier civilizations were maritime, or at least deeply connected to coastal networks, their way of seeing the world would differ fundamentally from later land-based empires. They would map routes rather than territories, relationships rather than possessions. Such maps, if inherited without context, might appear strangely advanced yet conceptually alien. Over time, copies degrade. Errors accumulate. Symbols lose meaning. Yet underlying proportions can persist, embedded beneath layers of interpretation. Like myths, maps can survive trauma by changing form while retaining structure. There is an uncomfortable parallel here. Just as oral traditions preserve emotional memory, maps may preserve spatial memory. Both outlive the systems that created them. Both become opaque when their original reference frames vanish. Modern analysis often treats these artifacts defensively. Anomalies are explained individually, isolated from one another. The possibility that they might share a deeper source is rarely explored openly. To do so would require entertaining continuity beyond accepted timelines, and that prospect unsettles foundational assumptions. But maps do not claim origins. They simply exist. They do not argue for forgotten civilizations. They imply them quietly through competence rather than assertion. The deeper implication is not that ancient peoples possessed secret global knowledge. It is that knowledge can persist longer than societies. That information can be carried forward through copying, adaptation, and reinterpretation, even after its creators are gone. This persistence complicates chronology. A map created in one era may contain information inherited from another. When we date the object, we do not necessarily date the knowledge embedded within it. The two are often conflated. The same applies to astronomical alignments, calendars, and mathematical conventions. They may be preserved long after their origin, used without understanding their original context. Over time, they become tradition rather than insight. If civilizations have been forgotten, their intellectual footprints may be hiding in plain sight. Not as monuments, but as conventions we no longer question, directions taken for granted, measures assumed to be intuitive, patterns treated as natural rather than inherited. This raises a quiet challenge. How much of what we consider foundational is actually residual? How many of our starting points are midpoints mistaken for beginnings? The reluctance to ask these questions stems from a desire for closure. Origins feel reassuring when they are close and clear. They anchor identity. They simply find narrative. Pushing them further back introduces uncertainty that feels unnecessary, even destabilizing. Yet uncertainty is not absence. It is presence without clarity. Maps that seem to know too much are not threats to knowledge. They are invitations to patience. They suggest that memory may operate on scales we are not accustomed to tracking. That information can drift across centuries, detached from its creators, waiting to be noticed. If earlier civilizations navigated the world differently, their perspective may survive even if their names do not. Their roots may persist in legend, their measurements in tradition, their understanding in fragments that feel oddly familiar. This does not diminish later achievements. It contextualizes them. It reminds us that human understanding is rarely isolated. It is layered, cumulative in some places, interrupted in others. The Earth reshapes itself relentlessly. Coastlines shift. Poles wander. Climate reorganizes life. Against this backdrop, mapping is an act of defiance, an attempt to stabilize relationship in a moving world. To say this is where we are relative to what surrounds us. If forgotten civilizations existed, they too would have mapped not necessarily on parchment, but in memory, story, and practice. Some of that mapping may still echo through time, misattributed, misunderstood, yet intact enough to disturb. The question that emerges is subtle. When we encounter knowledge that seems prematurely precise, are we witnessing invention or inheritance without memory? Are we seeing discovery or the resurfacing of something that once made sense in a different world? And if inheritance can persist without awareness, then forgetting becomes even more deceptive. A civilization may vanish while its understanding lingers, embedded invisibly in what follows. This thought carries a final unease. If we are capable of inheriting knowledge we no longer recognize as inherited, then we're also capable of losing knowledge without realizing what has been lost. We may mistake survival for completeness. Maps point outward, but they also point backward. They remind us that the world has been seen before, perhaps many times, from perspectives now inaccessible, and that our own view, however confident it feels, may one day appear just as fragmentary. If Earth has forgotten civilizations, their traces may not announce themselves with ruins or names. They may appear as quiet competencies we cannot quite explain, asking us not to believe, but to pause and to consider how much of what we stand upon was already known once by those whose world slipped beneath the surface, carrying its certainty with it. At some point, the straight line of history begins to bend. Not abruptly, but subtly. Like a path that curves so gently, its direction is only noticed after distance has been traveled. The idea that civilization moves forward, accumulating knowledge without reversal, begins to feel less like an observation and more like a belief. Many ancient philosophers did not share this belief. They spoke instead of cycles, ages that rise and fall, worlds that renew themselves through destruction, time not as an arrow but as a wheel. These ideas are often dismissed as metaphysical or poetic, but they persist across cultures that developed independently. Their persistence suggests not fantasy, but pattern recognition. Cycles are easier to perceive after repetition. A single collapse can be dismissed as failure. Multiple collapses invite interpretation. They suggest that instability is not accidental but structural. When modern thinkers encounter cyclical models of history, discomfort arises. Cycles undermine progress. They imply that advancement can be temporary, that knowledge can be lost as easily as gained. They challenge the assumption that the present is superior simply because it exists later in time. Yet the material records support it more readily than linear ascent. Civilizations rise rapidly, stabilize briefly, then decline. Their remnants are reused, reinterpreted, and eventually buried. Later societies rediscover techniques, principles, and ideas once known, often believing them to be new. This pattern does not require identical repetition. Each cycle differs in form, shaped by environment, population, and circumstance. But the structure remains recognizable. Growth, complexity, fragility, collapse, simplification, and reemergence. One of the reasons this structure is difficult to accept is scale. Cycles that span thousands of years exceed the horizon of individual memory. Written records rarely extend far enough back to reveal repetition clearly. What survives is often the last iteration mistaken for the first. When history is compressed this way, beginnings feel absolute. They acquire an almost sacred quality. To suggest that something came before feels transgressive, as if it diminishes what followed. That cycles do not diminish, they contextualize. There is also a psychological dimension. Humans prefer narratives with direction. They offer meaning. They promise arrival. Cycles, by contrast, offer no finality. They suggest maintenance rather than culmination, vigilance rather than destiny. If civilizations have been forgotten, cyclicity offers a framework that accommodates their disappearance without requiring exceptional explanations. They did not fail uniquely. They followed a pattern older than memory. This framework also reframes innovation. New ideas may not be unprecedented. They may be timely, emerging when conditions align, fading when they do not. What appears as genius may be resonance with structures already embedded in the human mind. Cyclicity does not deny creativity. It situates it within rhythm. Just as seasons shape growth without dictating form, historical cycles shape possibility without determining outcome. The resistance to this idea often stems from fear. If history cycles, then collapse is not an anomaly to be avoided forever. It is a phase to be managed. This challenges modern confidence in control, in permanence in the idea that technology alone can stabilize society indefinitely. Yet even technology obeys cycles. Systems grow complex, then brittle. Redundancy erodes in the pursuit of efficiency. Interdependence increases vulnerability. When disruption occurs, cascading failure follows. Recovery, if it comes, does so differently. Seen from this angle, forgotten civilizations are not mysteries hidden in the past. They are expectations waiting in the future. Not specific outcomes, but structural possibilities. This realization does not demand pessimism. Cycles are not condemnations. They are conditions. Understanding them allows preparation, adaptation, and perhaps memory. Memory may be the only variable that alters cycles meaningfully. Not memory of facts alone, but memory of fragility. Awareness that complexity requires care, that continuity must be cultivated. Ancient philosophies often emphasized this awareness. They warned against excess, imbalance, and hubris. These warnings were not moral abstractions. They were survival insights encoded in language that could endure. If such insights were born of experience, then the cycles they describe were not theoretical. They were observed. The challenge for modern thought is not to abandon linear models entirely, but to integrate cyclic understanding without surrendering agency, to recognize that progress and recurrence can coexist. That advancement does not guarantee permanence. This integration requires humility. It asks us to see ourselves not as the culmination of history, but as participants in a longer rhythm, one that has played out before, even if we do not remember the earlier verses. If Earth has forgotten civilizations, it may be because they mistook a phase for an end point. They believed their moment was stable enough to endure without effort. Or perhaps they understood the cycle, but lacked the means to preserve memory across it. Either way, the pattern remains. The unsettling calm that accompanies this realization comes from familiarity. The sense that what we face is not entirely new. That the questions we ask have been asked before under different skis, by people who also believe themselves advanced. And perhaps they were advanced in ways suited to their time, as we are suited to ours. The difference lies not in intelligence, but in awareness. Whether we recognize the curve of the path before it bends out of sight, whether we mistake the present for permanence or treat it as a moment within motion. If cycles govern civilization, then forgetting is not failure. It is default. Memory becomes the exception. The question that remains is simple and therefore difficult. Can a civilization learn to remember itself across cycles? Or will each iteration continue to awaken believing it is the first, unaware of how many times the same horizon has already been reached? If cycles shape civilization, then memory becomes the fragile hinge upon which each turn depends. Not memory as nostalgia, but memory as continuity. The ability to carry understanding forward without flattening it into myth or hardening it into doctrine. This ability appears rare, and its absence may explain why so much has been lost. Most civilizations remember selectively. They preserve triumphs more readily than failures, stability more than fragility. Collapse is framed as exception caused by unique misfortune or moral failure, rather than as an intrinsic risk. In doing so, the deeper lesson is missed. What remains is reassurance, not preparedness. Yet the archaeological and historical record suggests that fragility is the rule, not the anomaly. Complexity concentrates risk. The more interdependent a system becomes, the more vulnerable it is to disruption. This is not a flaw of intelligence. It is a property of systems. Ancient societies sensed this, even if they could not articulate it in modern terms. Many encoded warnings into ritual calendars, seasonal observances, and cosmological narratives. These were not superstitions. They were reminders, ways of synchronizing behavior with forces beyond control. Over time, however, reminders become habits. Habits lose urgency. Symbols outlive their reference. What once warned begins to comfort. The cycle repeats. Modern civilization is not exempt from this drift. Its confidence rests on scale, redundancy, and speed. Information travels faster than ever. Knowledge is stored across distributed systems. This creates the impression of resilience. But speed can amplify failure as easily as it amplifies success. Interconnection spreads disruption as efficiently as insight. There is a quiet irony here. The more we externalize memory into systems, the less practiced we become at holding it internally. When systems fail, the loss is total rather than partial. Earlier societies lost libraries, but retained oral memory. We risk losing both at once. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the reason forgotten civilizations appear so distant is not only because they were erased, but because they failed to preserve awareness of fragility. They remembered how to build, but not how to remember why building mattered. In this light, the absence of long-term memory is not an accident. It is a structural weakness. Civilizations optimize for growth, not endurance. They reward innovation, not maintenance. They assume continuity rather than guarding it. The Earth does not correct this assumption. It waits. What would it mean to design memory for survival across disruption? Not archives alone, but frameworks that remain meaningful even when context collapses. Stories that carry warning without requiring explanation. Practices that adapt without losing purpose. Some cultures attempted this. They embedded knowledge in landscape, in ceremony, in repetition. They treated memory as communal rather than individual. These methods were resilient but limited in scale. They could not easily coexist with expansive systems. Civilizations grew larger. Memory became centralized. Libraries replaced elders. Records replaced ritual. Efficiency replaced redundancy. This made knowledge powerful but brittle. The tension between scale and memory may be insoluble. What allows civilization to expand may simultaneously undermine its ability to endure. If so, forgetting is not a failure of will. It is a consequence of success. This reframes the question once more. How many civilizations has Earth forgotten? Perhaps all of them eventually, not because they were unworthy, but because they were complex. The present moment feels different only because we inhabit it. Every civilization likely felt unique from within, confident in its tools, certain of its insight, unaware of how ordinary that confidence was. This is not cause for despair. It is cause for attention. If forgetting is inevitable, awareness becomes precious. The ability to sense when continuity is thinning, to recognize when systems grow brittle, to remember not just facts but limits. The fragments we study from the past may represent attempts at this awareness. Monuments aligned with cycles, myths warning of imbalance, philosophies emphasizing humility. These are not relics of ignorance. They are traces of recognition. Recognition does not guarantee survival, but it alters response. It shapes behavior in subtle ways that may extend continuity longer than would otherwise be possible. Perhaps this is why the past continues to trouble us. Not because it hides secrets to be uncovered, but because it reflects patterns we are repeating. The unease comes from familiarity rather than mystery. Forgotten civilizations may not ask to be rediscovered. They may ask to be understood, not as anomalies, but as predecessors in a shared condition. The Earth has hosted many attempts at order, each shaped by its moment, each constrained by its environment, each convinced at least for a time of its own permanence. We stand within another such attempt, surrounded by memory yet vulnerable to forgetting, capable of extraordinary insight yet prone to repetition. The question that remains is not whether we will be remembered. It is whether we will recognize ourselves in those who are forgotten. Whether we will see their absence not as distance, but as proximity. And if we do, what will we choose to preserve? Not in stone or data alone, but in awareness, in the quiet understanding that civilization is not a destination, but a balance that must be renewed. Because if Earth forgets civilizations not out of cruelty, but out of indifference, then remembrance is not guaranteed by achievement. It must be cultivated deliberately against the grain of time. Whether such cultivation is possible at our scale remains uncertain, and in that uncertainty, the past waits patiently, not for rediscovery, but for recognition. At the edge of all these reflections, where fragments begin to blur into silence, there is a final tension that refuses resolution. It is the tension between knowing and remembering. Knowing accumulates, remembering endures. Civilizations excel at the first and struggle with the second. From a distance, the past appears like a sequence of attempts. Each civilization rises, believing it has learned enough to stabilize itself. Each inherits fragments of what came before, reshaped into foundations, myths, methods, or assumptions. Each stands upon layers of absence without fully sensing their depth. The Earth does not interrupt this process. It offers resources, constraints, and rhythms, but no guidance. What unfolds does so through human choice layered atop natural indifference. Collapse, when it comes, is not a judgment. It is alignment undone. What makes the forgetting of civilization so unsettling is not the loss of stone or language, but the loss of self-recognition. Each civilization seems unaware that it is participating in a pattern. It mistakes continuity for destiny. It mistakes scale for permanence. It mistakes memory storage for memory itself. The remnants we study now were once present moments, filled with urgency, confidence, and distraction. Their builders worried about governance, survival, meaning. They planned futures that never arrived. They assumed successes who did not come. From their perspective, the end would not have felt historic. It would have felt ordinary. A sequence of pressures, adjustments, compromises until suddenly what could be adjusted no longer could. This is how forgetting begins. Not with fire or flood alone, but with narrowing attention, with memory delegated to systems that outgrow understanding, with meaning replaced by function, with awareness dulled by repetition. The unsettling calm that settles over this realization comes from its familiarity. None of this feels alien. It feels current. The mechanisms that erased earlier civilizations are not hidden in the past. They are visible now, operating quietly, efficiently. And yet this does not imply inevitability. Patterns describe tendencies, not certainties. Cycles are not prisons. They are pressures. How civilization responds to them determines how much survives. Survival, however, may not look like endurance of form. It may look like endurance of insight. The ability to pass forward an understanding of fragility itself, to teach not only how to build, but how to doubt permanence. This kind of memory is difficult to encode. It resists monumentality. It does not translate well into data or law. It lives best in story, practice, and restraint. It requires humility, a trait civilizations rarely reward. Perhaps this is why it is so often lost. The civilizations Earth has forgotten may have achieved extraordinary things. They may have mapped skis, navigated oceans, organized societies with care and sophistication. But without mechanisms to preserve awareness across disruption, their achievements dissolved into residue. What remains are hints, alignments that still track cycles, stories that still warn, artifacts that still trouble categorization. These are not proofs. They are gestures, invitations to reconsider how we frame beginnings and endings. From this vantage, the question that began this journey feels different. How many civilizations has Earth forgotten? The answer matters less than what the question reveals. That forgetting is normal. That memory is rare. That the survival of understanding is more precarious than the survival of species. Perhaps Earth has forgotten countless civilizations. Or perhaps it has remembered them exactly as it remembers everything else, as layers, as compressed signals, as subtle shifts in structure rather than preserved narratives. What is clear is that no civilization remembers itself automatically. Memory must be practiced. It must be renewed deliberately, especially in times of stability when forgetting feels least urgent. As this reflection draws to a close, there is no conclusion to offer, only an image, a landscape long after its builders are gone. Stones softened by wind, paths reclaimed by growth, the sky unchanged beneath the surface, layers upon layers of effort, intention, and belief pressed flat by time, none erased completely, none intact. Somewhere within those layers lies the present moment, indistinguishable from the others once it passes. The question is not whether it will join them. It will. The question is whether anything essential will pass through intact. Not names or monuments, but awareness. The quiet recognition that civilization is not a permanent condition, but a fragile balance briefly held. If that recognition can be carried forward even faintly, then forgetting is not total. It becomes transformation rather than erasure. And if it cannot, then the Earth will continue as it always has, patient, untroubled, waiting for the next configuration of minds to ask the same questions again, unaware of how many times they have already been asked, and how softly the answers have always faded into the dark.